So Satan went out from the Lord, and it just goes downhill from there. We know that the stage is set for some kind of contest. In one corner we have God, who is obviously confident in the faithfulness of his servant Job. In the other corner we have Satan, or the Satan, the Hebrew translation of which is adversary or accuser. This is not the devil of New Testament thought, so as tempting as it might be, we can't accuse God of making a deal with the devil. In this story, the Satan is one of the heavenly beings whose function it is to patrol the earth. I suppose looking for those blameless, upright souls who might be tested, or to report back on all the sinful things that people are doing. God says, but how about my servant Job? There's no way he will turn away from me, no matter what you do. And Satan responds, well, of course he won't. You've surrounded him with your providence, you've protected him from evil, you've blessed the work of his hands, and now he's a wealthy man. But here's the question. Does he serve you only because of your generosity and blessing? Let's find out. Let's take it all away and see what happens. Now, Satan's proposal puts God in a rather awkward spot. If God refuses, it looks like God fears that there may be some basis for Satan's claim, and that wouldn't look very good on the resume. If God agrees and accepts the challenge, God comes across as looking pretty heartless. It's a no-win situation for God, no matter how we look at it. Nevertheless, God takes the challenge with the understanding that Job's life will be spared. After the rules of the contest are negotiated, disaster strikes. All of Job's animals are taken or slaughtered by the Sabaeans, all 500 yoke of oxen, all 500 donkeys, all 7,000 sheep, all 3,000 camels, along with all the servants who are caring for them. And then a devastating wind roars across the desert and blows down the house, or probably the tent, where all of Job's children are eating and drinking, and all of them are killed. 7 sons and 3 daughters gone. Upon hearing the news, Job gets up, tears his robe to shreds, shaves his head, falls on the ground, and worships God, saying, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Needless to say, that didn't work out quite the way Satan wanted it to. So at the next opportunity for the heavenly beings to present themselves to God, Satan comes along again. And the same scenario is played out a second time. Satan says he's just been walking up and down on the earth looking for those blameless, upright people, checking on the sinful ones. And once more, God offers up Job. Satan says, oh sure, people will give up all they have in order to save their lives. That's easy. Let's try something else and see if he doesn't cave in. And God agrees to the arrangement a second time, confident that Job will not waver in his faithfulness, once again exacting a promise from Satan that Job's life will be spared. So poor Job is tested again, this time by the appearance of horrible sores on his body from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. And while sitting in the ashes, scraping his skin with a piece of pottery, his wife comes and says to Job, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die. In other words, get it over with. How much more can we take?" But Job remains faithful, saying, "Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad?" And then for the next 36 chapters, after sitting on the ground in silence for 7 days and 7 nights, Job's good friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and Elihu, who slips in at the end, try to convince Job that he is somehow to blame for all the terrible things that have befallen him. And with friends like that, well, you know the end of that one. Let's just say they were a lot more helpful when they were sitting in silence throwing dirt on their heads. And it does say that, they were throwing dirt on their heads. The long, tedious conversation with his friends that takes place around the question of why Job is being made to suffer takes up most of the book of Job. And just at the point when you think there can't be anything left to say, just at the point when you begin to wish they would stop talking, just at the point where Job has reached his limit, God finally shows up. And we begin to hope that God is there to answer all of those questions. So can we breathe a sigh of relief? Not really, because at first it seems like God shows up to say, well, you think it's easy doing what I do? And in the end, we are left with more questions than answers. Through the centuries, Job has become the poster child for patience in the face of monumental adversity. Whenever we ask that million-dollar question, why do bad things happen to good people, somebody invariably brings up Job and his troubles. And whenever we talk about Job's comforters, we mean those people who have the uncanny ability to say exactly the wrong thing when they're trying to help. I think I'm safe in saying we have all been both. We've all had our Job moments, and we've all been Job's comforters. If we've learned anything from Job, it is that there are some things for which there are no good answers. There are some things that will forever remain a mystery. There are some things that we will struggle endlessly to understand and never be satisfied with the result. But we will keep asking. That's just how we're wired. Last week I was making a pastoral call, and I drove by one of those churches that have the outdoor sign with messages or sermon titles on it. The thought of which, by the way, is a nightmare to me, knowing how bad I am at sermon titles. Anyway, it caught me so off guard that I had to drive around the block to make sure I had read it correctly. On this particular day, it read, "Why do bad things happen to good people? Answer coming June 17th. And I said to myself, missed it. Which was followed by my thinking, well, I'm glad somebody has the answer. And then I thought, well, I wish I had known they had the answer. I wouldn't have agonized so much over this sermon. 30 years ago, Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote the book that has become the touchstone for wrestling with the question of human suffering. The title of the book is When Bad Things Happen to Good People, although any number of times I have heard people refer to it as that book by that Rabbi what's-his-name about why bad things happen to good people. As you probably know, Rabbi Kushner wrote the book as an expression of his experience of suffering. When their son Aaron was 4 years old, he was diagnosed with progeria, the disease that prematurely ages a child. As Kushner has often said, he was an ordinary rabbi living an unremarkable life with a loving family and a wonderful congregation. Nothing had prepared him for the kind of suffering that he and his child and his family were to endure. Rabbi Kushner admits a lifelong fascination with the book of Job. Like most scholars, Kushner believes that it began as a well-known folk story, a kind of morality fable that was told to reinforce people's religious sentiments about a pious man named Job. The author most likely used the folk tale to bracket the long section, the arguments about God that come in the conversation with Job's friends. Hebrew scholar Norman Gottwald said that as we're looking for a clear explanation of innocent suffering by the author, we will have trouble finding it, because none was intended by the author in the first place. Gottwald writes, "The book of Job is so eccentric and intensely psychological in its probing of the impact of physical, mental, sociocultural, and intellectual suffering that it is difficult to know what consequences the author intended to be drawn from it." Perhaps we can begin to unravel some of it by going to Kushner's suggestion that we consider 3 statements that Job and his friends, and probably most of us, would like to be able to believe, and give some thought as to how our beliefs about God hold up. So, A, God is all-powerful and causes everything that happens in the world. Nothing happens without God willing it. B, God is just and fair and stands for people getting what they deserve, so that the good prosper and the wicked are punished. C, Job is a good person. Kushner says that as long as Job is healthy and wealthy, we can believe all 3 of those statements at the same time. But when Job suffers, we have a problem. We can affirm any 2 of them only by denying the 3rd. We can't have all 3 and make it work out. Job's friends, of course, immediately give up the 3rd option. Clearly, Job is not the good person he claims to be. He must have done something to bring God's wrath upon himself. Job, for his part, isn't willing to hold the world together theologically by admitting that he's a bad person. He admits that he may not be perfect, but he's not any worse than anybody else by any moral standard, and he's not prepared to lie about it to save God's reputation. Job's solution is to reject the second proposition, the affirmation of God's goodness. Job is ready to say that God is so powerful that God is not limited by considerations of fairness and justice. In other words, God may choose to be fair, but can we say that an all-powerful God must be fair? Kushner suggests that the author of the book of Job takes the third alternative and is prepared to give up the proposition that God is all-powerful. He writes, "Bad things do happen to good people in this world, but it is not God who wills it. Forced to choose between a good God who is not totally powerful or a powerful God who is not totally good, the author of the book of Job chooses to believe in God's goodness." Which leaves us exactly where? Well, it leaves us with a God who leaves room for us to be human, and that's the hard part. If we believe that we have the freedom to choose to be a good person, to the best of our ability anyway, then do we also believe that we have the freedom to choose to behave in ways that hurt ourselves and others? If we're able to accept the idea that bad things happen to people, good and bad people, the sun rises on the good and the evil, and the rain falls on the just and the unjust, you remember. If we can accept that bad things happen for reasons that we cannot always explain, then can we accept the idea that the question may not be why, but rather what now? 20 years after Rabbi Kushner's book was published, another clergy person, Gregory Jones, wrote a small volume on the same topic entitled, "Play the Ball Where the Monkey Drops It." He begins by telling the story of the title of the book. The story is told of a golf course in India. Apparently, once the English had colonized the country and established their businesses, they yearned for recreation and decided to build a golf course in Calcutta. Golf in Calcutta presented a unique obstacle. Monkeys would drop out of the trees, scurry across the course, and pick up the golf balls. Knox writes that they tried various things, from building high fences around the fairways and the greens, not realizing that a fence is no challenge to an ambitious monkey. They tried luring the monkeys away from the course, and they tried trapping them and relocating them to another part of the city, but of course nothing worked. Finally, the golfers gave in to reality and developed a rather novel ground rule: play the ball where the monkey drops it. As you can imagine, playing this way was maddening. A beautiful drive down the center of the fairway could be picked up by a monkey and dropped in the rough. A hook or a slice that produced a miserable lie could be tossed onto the fairway. It wasn't long before golfers realized that golf on this particular course was very similar to our experience of life. We can play the course like a pro, but we can't control the outcome of the game. Like Kushner, Jones concludes that the only thing we can control is our response to the multitude of bad things that can and undoubtedly will happen to us. So how do we learn to play the ball where the monkey drops it? As I was leaving church on Friday after Margaret Mellom's funeral service, Amy asked me what I was preaching on this Sunday, and I said, Job, bad things, good people, yada, yada, yada. Amy asked if I liked preaching on Job, and I said no, because who wants to stand up here and say, I don't know about every third sentence? But here we are, so let me just say it. I don't know. I don't know how we learn to play the ball where the monkey drops it, or even how we learn to somehow find meaning in suffering, or even how we manage to get up in the morning when we are in the middle of a Job moment. But I know we do. At some point in our lives, we all do. Here's what I do know. I know that God shows up, and usually with more than just a litany of how hard it is to be God. God shows up, God provides presence, God's own presence, in the midst of our most unbearable suffering, through those people who care for us, who pray with us, who pray for us, who cry with us, who sit and listen to our weeping and our wailing without offering empty words of comfort. When we don't believe that we can go another day, I think God is present in those people who bring food to our front door, take the dog for a walk, and throw in a load of laundry. At the very moment when we most want to be alone in our grief and our pain and our sickness, God shows up, and like our Jewish mother says, you need to eat something. And when, like Job, all we can do is rage at the unfairness and cry out for mercy, when all we want is an answer, we get God. We get God. And that's enough. Amen.